everybody. Just gonna quickly go over biography of Kathryn Kiser. Kathryn Kiser is the Deputy Principal Officer at the U.S. Consulate in Erbil. And prior to Erbil, she served as Egypt's Office Deputy Director since 2018 and Acting Director in the Egypt office since June 2019. Katie also served as an economic counselor in Tunis, Tunisia, as the Libya External Office Political/Economic Chief, as the Egypt Desk's Political/Military Officer, as Cultural Affairs Officer in Lahore, Pakistan, as Political Officer in Amman, Jordan, and as Consular Officer in Osaka, Japan. Prior to joining the Department of State, Katie worked as a teacher, a museum program coordinator, and a custom picture framer. She graduated from the University of Florida with a BA in Anthropology and Philosophy and holds an MA in Japanese Studies from the University of London's School of Oriental and African Studies. She speaks Japanese and Arabic to varying effect. Katie is also the recipient of the Foreign Service Association's 2010 W. Averill Harriman Dissent Award.
Thank you, Irina. I really appreciate the introduction. And thank you, Javier, as well. I'm looking at your little video screen. This is great. Really thank you for setting this up. Nice to meet all of you virtually. I'm really sorry that I couldn't be with you in person, but I appreciate your patience with this forum under the current circumstances. Today, what I want to talk to you about is something that really is meaningful to me. It's the disability rights and how they have changed America. So I'm going to start with a brief history of the disability rights movement in the US. Then I'll walk you through the history to show how it led to the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is a piece of legislation that's important to this in America. And then I'll tell you how the legislation changed the landscape of America and actually made our country a very different place to be. So Javier, if you want to move it to the next slide, that'd be great. Okay. Perfect, thank you. So to understand the disability rights movement in America, you really have to go back to America's past. So I'm going to start in the 1800s, right? And then walk you through to 1990 when the act was passed. It's a long journey, but hopefully you can stay with me. So to understand the disability rights movement in America, you really have to go back to America's past. So I'm going to start in the 1800s, right? And then walk you through to 1990 when the act was passed. It's a long journey, but yeah. So in the 1800s, to be born with a disability was considered shameful. It was assumed the disabled, no matter what kind of disability they had, were also feeble-minded and unable to contribute to society. Numerous disabled persons were forced to undergo sterilization so they couldn't have children, and also were forced to enter institutions and asylums, such as what you see on the screen. This segregation was considered merciful at the time, if you can understand that. But what it really did was keep people with disabilities invisible from the rest of society. So society didn't really understand anything about the disabled because they never interacted with them. Next slide, please. This marginalization of people with disabilities continued until World War I. And that's when a lot of veterans had gone to fights during the war and they became disabled during the battles that they were involved in. And veterans with disabilities who came back to America expected that the US government would provide rehabilitation in exchange for the service they had given to the country. This changed the discussion about disabilities. Next slide. Yeah. So in the 1930s, the US saw advancement in technology because of these veterans who had returned and who wanted not the same old things that people with disabilities have been using up to that time, but the best technology to help them out with the disability. So here on the screen, you can see, here is a prosthetic leg, excuse me, from the 1910s. And it's just a peg without much structure to it. But you can look at the 1930s after World War I and see what happened with the advancements in prosthetics. making it look more like a human limb, and where it can bend at the knee, and just giving more thought to what people might need to function with a disability. It became expected the government would also provide veterans with assistance because of their disabilities. And this opened the door to the idea that people with disabilities could be self-reliant if they were given the right tools. Okay. Next slide. So despite these advancements in technology and the help that was given to disabled, there was still a stigma of weakness surrounding disabilities. So here on the screen, you can see President Roosevelt, who became our first disabled president in 1933. But he hid his disability so people wouldn't see it. The small picture inset, you can see him in his wheelchair. He had had polio as a child, and it caused him to lose the movement of his limb. But it's funny, the press never talked about it. They made sure not to show the photos of him in the wheelchair. And they really kept it hidden because, again, for him to be disabled was considered weak, and he didn't want to project that image to Americans. Disability at this time was seen as a thing that had to be sort of medically cured, not a thing that had to be accommodated or helped out, but really still kind of a thing that had to be hidden. No, that's great. Go ahead and go to the next slide up here. Thank you. Yeah. So then in the 1940s and 50s, the country received a second wave of disabled veterans, this time from World War II. And these veterans pressured the government to provide them not just rehabilitation, but vocational training, because when they came back, they wanted to work jobs. But of course, if you were disabled, such as the man in the poster, and had lost a limb, maybe working on a job would be a little bit difficult for you without the right technology and the right help. So this made disability issues much more visible in the United States and much more visible to US citizens. And citizens, when they saw the connection between what the men had done for the service to their country, right, began to take up the cause of veterans' rights, distinct from disabilities rights, but still inside of veterans' rights, the rights to have help from the government with their schooling, or have help finding jobs after the war. Disability rights became kind of a part of those veterans' rights that the discussion was framed around. Next slide, please. That's a very quick overview of the history. But despite these initial advancements, people with disabilities still did not have the access to public space, right? Even though the government was helping out veterans a little bit with issues they had after the war, as you can see from the picture, even if you had the best technology to help you to get around, it still couldn't cope with all the challenges of trying to maneuver within the public sphere. So this included no access to public transportation, no access to telephones, no access to bathrooms, no access to schools, to stores, to workplaces, just anywhere that would be considered normal for an able-bodied person to move around in. Disabled people found a barrier there when they tried to enter those spaces. And also employers and service providers, because people couldn't use the space, the physical space, use that as an excuse to refuse to employ people with disabilities, even if they were veterans, per se. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in the 1960s, we saw the civil rights movement emerge within the United States. And disability advocates saw the opportunity to join forces alongside other minority groups to demand equal treatment, equal access, and equal opportunity to jobs and the chance to participate in society fully. The struggle for disability rights was similar to many other civil rights movements. So disability advocates wanted to challenge stereotypes. They wanted to call for political and institutional change. And they just really wanted to lobby for what we think of as self-determination, the ability to control their own lives without the help from others, without being carried up and down stairs, without being given handouts from the government necessarily. They wanted the ability to actually function within the space and act in society the way that people who were able-bodied could act. At the forefront of this movement were actually the parents of the disabled who wanted their children to receive education. So remember that if you were a person who was perhaps in a wheelchair because of polio, like our President Roosevelt had been, or if you had some other disability, you couldn't physically get into the school. And the school might use that as an excuse to not give you an education, even though it was your right, disabled people felt, as a citizen. So you can see on the far right of the screen, a poster from that time period. And I'll read a little bit to you. The poster says, "The worst handicap of all, being deprived of the right to education. There are 7 million handicapped children in America. They need special education to develop their full potential as people, and they have a right to education. So again, seeing disability rights is really that. It's a civil right for people to grab hold of and advocate for. Next slide, please. Thank you. By the 1970s, the disability rights movement was in full force. And disability advocates were actually quite rowdy, the same way as other civil rights advocates have been. They began to focus on the legal and physical changes that would need to happen in the United States for them to interact as equal citizens to everyone else. A lot of this work was actually done in California and in Berkeley, a town that's pretty famous in California for civil rights and for protests and advocacy and marches and things. So here you can see on the screen a magazine cover from what's called The Independent, which was a magazine put out for the disabled at that time. And it's demonstrating how hard it is to go from the street to the sidewalk. So just the most basic concept of how you could interact with and move around town if you were in a wheelchair, for example. So to get around this idea, remember, because they were all thinking of what legal and physical changes would have to happen so they could interact in society without assistance, without being lifted, right? You can see in the top corner, some people started to sketch out what would it look like if we made little ramps from the sidewalk down to the street. In America, we called it a curb cut. And curb cuts became famous in Berkeley, and the very first ones were actually installed in Berkeley in 1974. And you can see a picture of one down below with the man in his wheelchair using it to get from the sidewalk to the street so he can cross the street without assistance. So as a result, the first US legislation recognizing the civil rights of the disabled was passed in 1973. It was part of an act to help vocational rehabilitation, so to help people get into the job force, and they included the disabled as part of that act. It said that if your organization was taking money from the US government, you were not allowed to discriminate on the basis of mental or physical disability. So I want to stress, it was only if you were taking money from the government, right, federal money, and you were hiring people that you were not allowed to discriminate. Anyone else could discriminate at will, right? In 1975, so a couple of years later, legislation was also passed to guarantee equal access to public schools for children with disabilities. Not private schools, mind you, not religious schools, but if it was a public school, a school receiving funding from the government, then they could discriminate and they had to allow in students with disabilities to participate in school. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. But what the disabled community really wanted was a comprehensive piece of legislation clearly guaranteeing their civil rights in all aspects of society. Right? And that is where the Americans with Disabilities Act comes into play. Right? Next slide. Perfect, right there. Thank you. And this draft law that the advocates have put together proposed two main things, right? And was quite radical at the time. They wanted to make not just the public space, so the space that was funded by the government, accessible. They wanted to make private space, the private sector, accessible for disabilities as well. And they wanted to require that the private sector would have to accommodate people with disabilities so they could enter those private spaces as easily as they could enter a public space. They also wanted all areas that are normally accessed by citizens in this course of everyday life to be accessible with persons with disabilities. So the idea that anything that you and I could do as an able-bodied person, they wanted to be able to do as well without assistance, just because we had designed the space in a way they could interact the same way as anyone else. When the bill was introduced in the late 1980s, right, so quite a long time after the 1800s, right, businesses and local governments really pushed back hard. And this was because it included this idea that the private sector would have to be making accommodations, so the public sector make accommodations equally. They said to do so would be way too expensive, and it would be just a huge burden on the public budget. We could never afford it. Okay. So disability advocates, because they really wanted these two things, they saw it as being a civil rights issue, not a gift from the country, but a thing they deserved. They began to do all kinds of really radical things, things that we wouldn't necessarily think of disabled people as taking part in. So this includes holding protests, of course. At one point, they chained themselves to buses, right, to demonstrate that they couldn't access the public transport. They took over public buildings. They had a huge sit-in that lasted actually for several days in California, where they took over some federal buildings. They marched on Washington, and the March on Washington became quite well known at the time because it was visually very affecting. So if you go to the next slide, Habir. Yeah. So marching on, don't play the video yet, but marching on Washington is a pretty traditional way to protest when you feel your civil rights are not being met in America. I think we all know about Martin Luther King's March on Washington, for example. So the disabled wanted to do something similar. The picture you see on the screen is the American Capitol. It's the Congress building. And it's a little bit hard to see with the bar there, but there's a huge number of steps going up to the Capitol. So some of the disabled who were involved in this protest had the idea that they would climb up these steps and just demonstrate to lawmakers how hard it was for them to access the most foundational part of their government. So I'm going to ask Javier to play you a video. I will be upfront with you, this video makes me cry, so I will probably go off screen so you guys can watch it. But I wanted to give you a sense of what it looked like and what people saw after all these decades of protests and movements and attempts to get change in American society that would benefit disabled and recognize their civil rights. Okay. So I'll let Javier play the video. I'm going to disappear for a little while so I don't weep at you.
The hope was that this would bring attention to their cause and the act would be signed. Over 1,000 people gathered from 30 different states. Rallies and speeches were held throughout the day, leading up to the most important event.
The night before, they asked for volunteers to, crawl up the steps, And I thought it was a great idea. Some people were really against it. They thought that it would be really demeaning to see a bunch of disabled people crawling up steps, So why not let them see some reality? And there was this little girl who was right ahead of me, And I said, oh my gosh, this little girl is she has cerebral palsy. This little girl is gonna climb up the steps ahead of me and I'm not gonna be able to make it. And she's gonna make me look really stupid,
Hey, come on, Jennifer. Come on.
You want to take a break all night if I have to.
Thanks, Javier. So you guys could see what was so affecting about this. This was the image that people saw on television. And it was all over the news, especially the image of the little girl. Her name is Jennifer. She later grew up and gave very interesting testimonies talking about what it was like as a kid climbing up these steps. But people have said that it was probably her image, actually, that helped really push President Bush to sign the act into law. So Javier, if you'll go to the next slide. Yeah. So after all these decades of lobbying, right, this comprehensive piece of legislation was signed into law on July 26, 1990. You will notice that it's exactly 30 years ago today. And it was signed by the first President Bush. And it was the world's first comprehensive declaration of equality for people with disabilities, right? I want to stress that, the first in the world and the most comprehensive that the world has ever seen. So it stipulates a few things. I'm going to explain to you kind of what it says. And ask you to be patient while because it's quite comprehensive legislation, right? So persons with disabilities must receive the same employment opportunities and benefits as persons without disabilities, not only in government, but also from private business. And that public areas had to be accessible for persons with disabilities, not only government-run areas like parks and embassies or public buildings, but also privately owned areas that were accessible to the public. So for example, a hotel, a store, a restaurant, a private school, a health club, a sports stadium, all these things had to be accessible for the disabled. This also included telecommunications. So all of a sudden, all the phone companies had to become accessible for people with disabilities. And nowadays, we also interpret this to include internet providers. So people making web pages actually are required to provide a version of that is accessible for people who might be blind or deaf and have other trouble accessing or barriers to accessing the internet. And it also said that both public transportation, so things like subways or trains, and also private transportation, so things like taxis, would have to be accessible for persons with disabilities. Okay. So really, by passing the ADA, by President Bush signing this into law in 1990, the US government said that by law, persons with disabilities had the same right to participate in everyday activities in their communities, such as buying an item at the store, watching a movie in a theater, enjoying a meal at a local restaurant, exercising at the gym, or having their car serviced at a local garage. Like all the same rights that people without disabilities had, now disabled people have those rights too. Can you go to the next slide, Javier? So given how big and comprehensive this legislation was, what in America had to change to make this happen? And I won't leave it a mystery for you. If we can go to the next slide. Yeah, everything, really everything had to change. Like it's mind-boggling to think about what this legislation caused to happen in America. Imagine if you were told a disabled person was going to come live in your house starting tomorrow, right? What would you have to change in your house to make it possible for that person to do everyday things? If the person was in a wheelchair, right, you might need to replace your stairs with a ramp. Okay? You would need to make your doors and your hallways wider to accommodate the wheelchair going through them. You would need to completely redo your bathroom and probably your kitchen. You might need to change your tables, your closets, right? Say the person who was coming to live in your house was blind. You would have to add Braille signage in your house so the person could get around and read things and access them. You would need to have appliances like a microwave that gave voice options so they could hear what they were doing when they pressed the buttons, right? Say the person was deaf and couldn't hear, right? You would need to make sure your doorbell and your phone and your smoke alarm gave visual alerts like flashing lights to indicate when there was a problem. You might also need to hire an interpreter, just so many things you would have to do to make your house accessible for all range of disabilities of who might come to it. So you can understand why businesses kind of panicked when they heard that they had to do this seemingly overnight. Can you go to the next slide, please, Javier? No. So here's an example of a small kind of standard business in the US, just a little hair design store, right? A little hair cutting place. And businesses like this were the ones that really were terrified of the Americans with Disabilities Act. They really didn't know how they were going to put it into place. They didn't understand what to do to make their places accessible. And they thought whatever it was going to be too expensive and they could never afford it. So they saw it as the government imposing this really horrible expense on top of them. So the government recognized that the person who owns this small store doesn't have all the tools they need to implement this new piece of legislation that we had created. So the government did two things, which are actually really smart. The government does not always do smart things, but in this case, it did smart things. First, it set national standards of accessibility, right? So that everyone knew exactly what needed to be changed. And I'll give you an example of what these national standards. Javier, can you show the next slide? Yeah. So here's an example of a door handle model to show businesses what they could and couldn't install in their office space to make things accessible. So you can see that on the left-hand side of the screen, 2 door handles that are not accessible, things that would be difficult for people with disabilities to use. On the right-hand side, you can see 2 examples of door handles that are accessible. Things that with just installing a door handle, which is not that expensive, you could make the door easy for someone with disabilities to open it. Second thing it did was it told businesses to start with those changes that were easiest. So the things that are not too difficult. Don't start with the biggest, most expensive thing possible. Do what you could and take your time and show that you were trying to get to the goal of making it completely accessible, and the government would be forgiving. This is especially true for smaller businesses that had smaller budgets. If you were a big business, you were expected to be making changes more quickly, right? So Javier, can you show the next slide? So here's an example of that same business, right? Before and after it was made accessible through the ADA, to comply with the ADA, with the Americans with Disabilities Act. And they added a new landing ramp, right? To give space for a wheelchair to come up to the door. They put in a ramp instead of the stairs so you can get in your wheelchair from the entry up into the doorway. They added a new handle so that if you had trouble using your hands, you could use the doorknob more easily. So with some simple changes that weren't too expensive, this place was actually able to become accessible and become more compliant with the Disabilities Act. I should say also, there was where I'm showing you a change that was made from an existing business to make upgrades. What this law also said was if you're building a new building, you should make these upgrades from the beginning. Don't wait until after the building was built and then try and redesign it. So that's one thing it did too, was that new buildings were always expected to be up to the standards of the Act from the first stone that was laid. So slowly the face of America started to change. This includes curb cuts, includes the ramps like you see in this picture, elevators appeared in more places, braille signage. And I want to give you an example of a place that's kind of iconic for America that's become accessible that maybe you wouldn't think about. So can you show the next slide, Javier? Yeah. So this is Yankee Stadium in New York, a place you can go and watch baseball games, right? And when I was doing research to look at this presentation, I was really impressed by all the things that the stadium had done to make itself accessible to people with disabilities. So this includes, you can see down in the right-hand corner, they had changed their buses so that you could wheel onto them with your wheelchair from the parking lot, right? They are providing formats now in Braille. So if you showed up to get the schedule of the game, for example, you could have the option of receiving it in Braille. So if you're blind, you could read it without having someone read it to you. They've got listening devices at the stadium. So if you are hard of hearing, you can go to a special counter and they'll give you a device to listen to free of charge that will help you understand what the announcers are saying in the game. They also, you can see in the bottom picture, they also display the words of the announcers on a big screen in the stadium so everyone can see them. They've got concession stands there that are accessible. The menus are fully Braille accessible so that if you go up to buy your hot dog, you can do so. You can choose from different options you have without having to have someone read the menu to you. They've got elevators, of course. They've cut out places for seats so that if you're in a wheelchair, you don't have to be in the aisle. You can be in this same row as everyone else. And they even have special plugs at the stadium now. That if your wheelchair is running out of power, you can plug it in to recharge in case they go into extra innings. So it's a really impressive sort of overview of what all had to happen in America. And now we see these things, we don't really even think about them. It's really standard to go to an ATM, for example, like you see the picture there. And even as I am pushing the buttons, I'll feel the bumps of the Braille on the pad. I don't think about it. But those things are there because this act demanded that they make even the ATMs accessible. I would say even 30 years later, America is still making upgrades and we're learning about what things people need in your public space. One of the recent examples I saw was that public pools now, there's a move to make the public pool in each little town accessible. And that's done by bringing in a machine that can lift up the person who might need help getting to the pool, lift them into the pool, and then taking them back out. And it was funny hearing people talk about what it was like installing these machines. People said, but no one with disabilities comes to the pool. And then we could point out, well, it's because they can't use the pool until this machine is there. So that's what the difference it has made in America, is just making people more aware of how you implement this act and really bring people who might have trouble accessing public space, that is their right, into the public space with everyone else in society. So obviously this had a huge effect on Americans with disabilities, right? Before, just leaving your home was a huge struggle. But now you could demand, under this law, to be able to partake in everyday activity, to receive accommodation, to allow you to go to school, to do your job, to travel, to play a sport, really just to live your life. Can you show the next slide, Javier? So I found this quote that I really like. It was put out at the time of the 25th year anniversary of the ADA. And I'll read a little bit of it to you. It's a testament of a woman who had a friend in a wheelchair. And she says, when I was a teenager, my friend Bay, a wheelchair user, and I would go to her favorite pizza restaurant. It was always a challenge to get inside. I often felt like we had to run an obstacle course first. There wasn't a ramped entrance, and the curb cut, remember that the movement from the street to the sidewalk was really high. So I would imagine it was a struggle to get the wheelchair up from the street onto the curb. She said, once inside, forget about using the restroom. her chair wouldn't fit through the doorway, which is only 24 inches wide. Today, she said, after passage of the American Disabilities Act, Bay and I can go to many restaurants together, just like everyone else. And we aren't tired before we eat, having to run this obstacle course to get to your meal. She said we can also use the restroom if necessary, and just was celebrating the fact that she could be with her friend in a public space for the first time ever. Next slide, please. Yeah. There are other things that came up with this act as well that I think people weren't expecting, but were good. Because kind of like how that past slide referred to people without disabilities benefiting from this act, I want to tell you how people without disabilities benefited more directly from it, right? So here in this picture, you can see former President Obama. And the man on the right is actually my friend Joe. And Joe is a sign language interpreter. So his whole job is to go around and to interpret for people so that if anyone's deaf in the audience, they can understand what's being said. You can imagine how important this is for people who are deaf. If they can't hear what the president's saying, they can't make good decisions about who to vote for and things like this, right? But Joe's job is one, he doesn't do it on the side. That's his full-time job. And I wouldn't normally talk about salaries, but I want to explain to you how important this is for him. He makes around $80,000 to $90,000 a year. It's a complete living wage. And his job wouldn't be possible at all if it weren't for the Americans with Disabilities Act creating a need for this, right? And that's true of a lot of other things too. Like the act had to have people to write regulations. It had offices to oversee how the act was being done. And those are things that able-bodied people can take part in just as well as disabled can. Can you show the next slide, Hubbard? It's also, as the testimony, the one with the pizza restaurant and her friend in the wheelchair example shows, has enabled us to have new relationships. So these are my friends, Peter and Judy, right? Peter is deaf. You can't tell it from the picture, of course, but, and Judy is obviously in a wheelchair. They couldn't access public space in a way that I could even meet them, except for this act having been passed. And it's lovely to have them in my life. Like I couldn't do that if it weren't for this act and how it enables them to actually get around and function within society. So we can go out together, we can talk to each other. Peter has had education from a school that was accessible, that allows him to speak with me, even though I can't do sign language. So it's been, from this aspect as well, another way that's enriched people, even if they aren't disabled. Can you do the next slide, Javier? Another thing I want to point out is that there's ease for caregivers. So a lot of folks are, even if they're not disabled, they're taking care of people who are disabled. And that's particularly true if they're taking care of people who are elderly. The sad truth is that even though we don't think about it, every single one of us become disabled at the end of our lives, right? So in this case, this is a picture of the movie theater where I could go with my grandma, who was in a wheelchair. And if it weren't for the space being cut out there on the side, we could never have gotten close to the screen where she could actually interact and do things with me. Same with going to restaurants and things. Her being in the wheelchair didn't stop her from enjoying the last part of her life. And it made it easier for me too. I wasn't stuck at home with her. Like we could go out and do things together. It was funny, President Bush, the first President Bush who signed the act into law, he gave a testament later at one of the anniversaries saying that after he became elderly was when he really appreciated the act, because he was able to take advantage of it and gain the benefits from it, not just seeing disabled people participate in society as full citizens, but he was able to participate in society up till the end of his life for that reason as well. I would also say it's just easier since the ADA was passed for everyone to get around, right? Any change in design of a public space that makes it easier for the disabled to access that space will also make it easier for people without disabilities to access that space, right? So example, if they can go up and down steps more easily, right? If doors are made easier to open, that's going to benefit us as well. And I actually think that's changed a lot of how Americans function. So I want to give you an example, right? Javier, can you show the next slide? Yeah. So here is a picture of a stroller from the 1970s, right? You probably have seen ones like this before. It's the kind that my mom used with me. You know, kind of rickety, only big enough for one kid, right? You know, pretty standard stroller from the 1970s before the act was passed, right? Can you show the next slide, Javier? Here's a stroller from today. You'll notice some differences between the two, right? And you may have noticed the trend in America of lots of strollers becoming quite large and accommodating more people, more things as people push them around. So it's a great question to think about, why have we had the change in stroller design, right, which makes it easier for parents with family members, with children to get around. Why has that changed since the 1970s? So I would make one suggestion as to why this change is possible. Can you show the next slide, Javier? Oh, we're frozen. I hope we haven't lost Javier. Oh, that's it. Perfect. Thank you. So I think this is the reason that the new stroller technology, which has made it easier for parents, is even possible in the United States, because of curb cuts, because of ramps. I mean, you can see it's a way that making the design more accessible for everyone has made it easier for parents to get into society with their children. So that's just one small example of ways that this has really changed how all of us approach public space, how all of us interact with each other. Can you show the final slide, please? Thank you. The most important thing for me too is I think it makes us more tolerant as a society to have
بەڕێزان ببورن کێشێک لە ئینتەرنێتە هەیە دیارە خەتەکەی لای خاتون خاوە بەڵام چەند دقەیەک چارۆکە نەگەڕێتەوە سەلامە
Sorry, everyone. I hope you can hear me now. So as I was saying, I think the most important thing about this act is that it's made us more tolerant as a society. That your local restaurant, your mosque, school, and people who are disabled, who are blind or deaf, or but they're still a person. Then maybe you can meet someone who has a different religion or ethnicity or social class or speaks a different language and think the same thing. Yeah. So thank you guys so much for listening to my presentation, and apologies for the little small glitch we had with losing you guys at the end. But I'd be really honored to take your questions and to hear your own thoughts about disability rights, maybe here in the Kurdistan region or in Iraq more broadly, or any other experience you've had that you think is relevant.
Thank you. We will wait for the questions.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. بەڕێزان هەر بەڕێزێک پرسیاری هەیە ئەتوانێت ڕێزهاند بکات بۆی کە ئێمە وەری بگرین ئەتوان دەستان بەرزکەنەوە بۆی کە وەرتان بگرین بۆی کە پرسیارەکانتان بکەن بەس بە ئەرەگەی پرسیارەکانتان بە پەیوەندی بە بابەتەکەوە هەبێت I will unmute Hevar Zebari.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for this very nice presentation, an interesting topic, actually. Thank you for the hosts, for the co-hosts, for everyone. Just one simple thing I want to add to this topic is that I actually studied my master's in transportation engineering. This is a very controversial topic in the transportation engineering, or using public transportation in general. So I had taken a very dense topic about this, a course about this topic. It's called ergonomics. So I don't know if we have actually kind of disabled people with us now as a participants in this presentation, but in the ergonomics, they told us actually we don't have, or we can't say, or even in the public, I think it makes sense, is that we can't say like deaf people or blind people. We need to say vision impaired or hearing impaired and such kind of terms in order not to like hurt their feelings and to be more tolerant towards them. And regarding the topic itself, I think in one day or another, we all going to be disabled in one term, I don't know. But so in Kurdistan, if we think about this, in terms of transportation engineering, actually, we don't have that very well designed infrastructure and public transportation. But the only public transportation that we have is the taxis, which unfortunately nobody have thought about, like taking into consideration the disabled people, like physically disabled people. Or I have been to more than like 14, 15 European countries. I have faced like all the interesting solutions for the disabled people, but unfortunately, I have never seen such solutions here. Like the very, very important one, I think, which is really necessary nowadays in the markets or the downtowns, is the braille walkways, as we have so many vision impaired people. That's all what I could share with you. Thank you very much. I hope I have had an interesting point to the topic. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you did. And thank you for your point about the labels that we use. You're right. For me to say deaf and blind and things like this, some people find that offensive. So I should have started at the beginning to say I was going to use simplified terms to try and make this easier for me as I'm doing the presentation, because I mumble very badly. So I appreciate your patience with that. And you're right. It's what is polite, I found, is to ask people how they want to be referred to. And that's not what I would do before I was presenting, especially with someone else who was with me who was disabled. I also wouldn't assume that people who are on the screen are not disabled. I really don't know anything about people's backgrounds, who are in their family, what sort of things you're struggling with. So apologies if I offended anyone with that language. But I hope that you were still able to take things out of the presentation that was useful for you.
Manal?
Hello, everyone. Hello, Ms. Kaiser. Thanks a lot for this nice webinar. Really, we got many informations and we appreciate that. Really, the subject is considered as one of the important subjects with many questions that are arising for every person's mind. I have some questions really I want to know from your experiences about the matter. What disabilities does the American with Disabilities Act cover? And could you give us the exact or nearly percentage that whom related to these disabilities? Are these disabilities become increased or decreased? I'm talking about the American society in addition to if you have information about the nearby or the world. So about the rates, how it become their situation nowadays, and what are the considerations that the American Disabilities Act have toward it. And I'm asking about how we can make opportunities that easier to those persons with disabilities in order to do and react more with those normal one in equality without any barriers between them as they are persons, and what are the role of the organizations and those especially related to the human rights organizations toward those. In addition to the government laws, I think that the government, not only in one country, in all other countries, either developed or undeveloped, must put strong laws and rules for those due to equality with those normal one in reading and either in the field of studying, in the field of, for example, for letting them some opportunities in working, sharing information with others. The final question I have, or the last one, about the healthcare centers. What about the health sector? The health sector has responsibilities and duties toward those disabilities. As you know, they mostly deafness, blindness, or cancer, epilepsy, those things. The healthcare, do you think that not only I'm asking about the American society, but all the others, how their rules, do it's strong or they aid him? They are continuous rules with them, and how we can develop the role of the health sector to be more encouraging them, getting, for example, treatments for them, and how the concerns between them and all the fields that I'm concerned. And thanks a lot for you again.
You're welcome. Thank you for all the questions. I'll try and answer them in order. If I miss one, apologies, we can go back to it. You'd asked first about sort of how the rates of disability in America, for example, and sort of how that was playing out in society. I don't have a good stat on how the rates have changed. My guess is that the rate has increased actually rather than decreased, because as we've discovered more of what people need to have accommodations for, our definition of disability, I think, has grown. So let me tell you that according to the Americans with Disabilities Act, they define it actually very precisely. They say disabilities is a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity, right? So for example, Javier has lovely glasses, right? That we don't consider him disabled even though he has an impairment, because that it's not taking away from his major life activity. He can easily be accommodated. But if he had actually lost his vision, then that would limit his life activity quite severely. So there's a gradation a little bit in how this act is done. You'd have to actually reach the bar of limiting a major life activity to be considered disabled under the Americans with Disabilities Act. I think at the same time, a lot of the definitions around mental handicaps, right, mental impairment have increased in America, is my guess if you looked at society and where the increases happen. Just as we become more aware of society and less shamed about talking about these things, the information comes out, we can catalog it more easily. The statistics I have are that 18% of America's population has a disability. So nearly 1 in 5 people in America. It's about 52 million Americans. I looked for statistics actually on Iraq as well to try and find out what we could say about the country's population here. All I could find was that according to the UN, Iraq has one of the largest populations of disabled persons in the world. And that's primarily due to the conflict that has happened recently. So kind of like with World War I and World War II, I'm wondering if it will change how disabilities are viewed within your own countries as people who've been involved in those conflicts come back and are now maybe disabled from things that they were doing for their country or due to terrorism or things like that. That might change people's thinking about what it means to be disabled and who qualifies as a disabled person. You'd asked a little bit about the healthcare system. The healthcare system is considered public access, just like anything else. So a hospital would have to be accessible to the disabled. There's a lot of discussion about healthcare in America, but this is a piece that I think is actually pretty good for Americans. One of the things that the Act allows, and this touches on your question of how organizations can be involved, the Act sets up offices. So if you as a disabled person go to a public space and you find it's not accessible, right, you find they're not following the law to the best of their ability, you can actually call an office that's related to this Act, and they will go to the business and help the business become compliant. It's a complicated and long procedure, right? Because there's money involved and you know, there's bureaucracy, of course. But that is where organizations and people can become real advocates for keeping up the American Disabilities Act and making sure that, you know, the civil rights of the disabled are not ignored, that we really adhere to the rules of this act. And like I said, because now, you know, I remember a little bit of when, before this act was passed. I was born in 1978. So you know, I can remember sometime before 1990. But most of my adult life, I remember having braille signs, having curb cuts, having elevators. Like, those things are natural to me. And I think that it feels more natural now for people who have grown up with this act being implemented to assume that, yeah, you ought to be having you know, spaces accessible for the disabled. And those places were falling down. You know, human rights organizations can lobby the government, can lobby businesses to change the ways that they're acting to make sure they comport with the law. I hope I answered all your questions. If you think of other ones, please let us know.
Ms. Shanao? Shanao?
Hello, everyone.
Hi.
How are you? Before anything, thank you, good presentation, and thank you for American Corner for regulating this event, and thank you for you, Lady Kathryn. Before anything, my name is Shanao. I'm legal officer at Heartland Alliance. I'm international and relation director and blind union organization in Kurdistan, Iraq. So you talk about disability right in America and how grow up from last 30 years. I wanna speak about the disability right in Kurdistan. And I think it's very low right in Kurdistan about the disability. And also we try like blind, our organization, like blind union organization, we are trying to change social mind and change personality mind. And we are trying with the government for performing all the requests about the disabled people. But till now, we are never seen the good reaction with in society and this government. And we are requesting and we are waiting you can support us and support our case, our disability case, for lobby for us with the Kurdistan government and Iraqi government and NGOs for making opportunity for disability people, for working, for changing mind society about the disability people. And so we are waiting you can coordinate with us with the activism of disabled people and for lobbying with the government, because we have a good law in Kurdistan. I want to know about it, but the government don't good reaction about it. And so the last thank you for us and for all, and the good meeting. Thank you.
Yeah, if I'm still muted, I hope. Thank you for your comments. Is it okay if I have time to respond to him, Javier? I can't tell if I'm muted or not. That's why I'm asking if it's okay if I respond.
Yeah, you're on.
Am I on? Oh, fantastic. Sorry about that, guys. Yeah, I take your point very much, and that we want to be partners with all aspects of human rights, including disability rights. One thing my colleagues who are helping to run the video have reminded me of is we have a small grants program here at the U.S. Consulate, where if your organization has identified an area that they would like to advance, such as disability rights or other things in your society, you can actually apply for a grant from the U.S. Consulate, and we can perhaps help support you in the work that you're doing. It's a competitive process. It's not a guarantee, of course. But if that interests you, I'll ask for Habir and others to send out the information about that so that people can apply.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
John Rowe. John Rowe.
Yes, I can speak.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for this meeting. I am Mr. John Rowe from Modern Education. I was also working for blind people. I will speak shortly. Just you speak about the job opportunity. There is, if you kindly assist us for the World Union Organization, they submit sometimes all jobs for consultations for depending upon the blind rights. But when we submit it, our English is not very good. They don't choose us. If you speak also, this is about with them, if you know them or if you have relation with them. This is very important because the blind people are facing very problems in this during this corona because they cannot go out. Everyone tell them don't touch anything. They are staying homes and they are in very bad situation. So if you do something for the job opportunity for them, some of them are graduated from university, but their English are not good. That's all what I speak about. Thank you for this meeting. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for that. I don't know the organization you're referring to, but I'll talk to my colleagues and see if we have any connection with them. One thing I can say is if you ever see job opportunities here at the consulate, we don't discriminate based on disabilities. That's because we are under the governance of this American Disabilities Act. So if you're applying for a job with us, you can be guaranteed that we'll consider you just like anyone else, regardless of any disability you might have.
Mr. Himan?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you for your opportunity, actually. I am a teacher, and I'm training a teacher, not in the city, in Suli. It's out of the city. It's far away in the city, actually. And I have two students, They have issues. They are autism. They have the autism. Is that the subjects connect with your subject?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Autism.
That's considered a disability in America under the Disabilities Act, yes.
So did you have any advice for us, like a teacher? And another thing, like a government, Kurdistan government, we have any organization deals with some situation like that. And after that, you like the consulate Erbil, did you have can help us just the situation can handle it, solve the problem because they are actually need more help. We cannot solve more of problem they have it. Yeah. Because we just the teacher for teaching the normal student. They are not normal. And thank you again.
Yeah. The problem you're describing is one I've seen in a lot of other countries, and frankly, it's still a problem that we have in America. We're moving past the point. It used to be that autism was considered kind of shameful, the way that a lot of mental handicap was considered shameful in America. Despite the fact that the American Disabilities Act clearly says that mental handicap is covered under this law. So we're still struggling in our own schools sometimes to figure out how to best accommodate people with autism and other handicaps such as that. It's really tough because I think what we're discovering is that you have to do it and work with the individuals. It's hard to have a blanket solution that covers every single case you might encounter. So I will tell you that in America, the situation that you're describing, you would probably have, the government would provide someone to sit in the classroom with the student, perhaps. The government might provide some special materials for the student to help her or him understand the lessons. we call this mainstreaming. This is the word for it in education in America. It's a little bit controversial because some people think that if you mainstream disabled persons into the school system, that it can hurt them, that it can be bad for their education. So I don't want to pretend that it's not a sensitive topic in the United States. But that's what the law says, is that we have to try to accommodate them. And so I want to thank you for what you're trying to do for those two students, because what you're describing is a thing that in America would take multiple people with a lot of resources to try and address. And to try and do so as one teacher without any training, without any resources, is brave, and I think is really speaks to your heart as a teacher. I don't know of any organizations myself that could help you. My guess is that I can look for some though in America who might be able to give you some advice. One of the troubles I've seen is that without a really community system of support, it's very hard for just the school to help support the student to the level they would need to really function equally within society. But you are not alone in the struggle that you're facing. There are quite a few other countries that are dealing with the same issue. And if you'll give your contact information to Javier, let me go back and talk to some of the people I know back in America who might be able to at least suggest some things to you, or give you some resources, even just online, that you can watch that might help you with the situation.
Sorry, everyone. Due to time, we only take only one questions. Sorry, Suzanne.
Okay.
From Suzanne.
Hello. Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hi. Thank you, and thank you for this opportunity to include us. Thank you for that. Actually, there is something I would like to talk about. Really, last time I went to a government agent to get someone a salary because I'm attorney. Instead of their parent, I went there. He's a disabled person. So, there is no respecting, nothing. When I said, why you are not respecting these disabled people or their parent, they say, oh, because we are not getting our salary. So how can we respect other people? So I said, that's not their fault. This is something else. So why you are not respecting? So we had a little bit not nice conversation, but it's this thing happening all the time, every month when the disabled people goes to take their to get their salary. Really, I don't know if you can help with this or no. I know it's something it belongs to government, but really. I have to talk about because it's the right time to talk about.
Yeah.
So that's all. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that comment. I find that in times of stress, and kind of like what the reaction of the business was, and then even local governments when we pass this legislation, how will we afford it? What will we do about it? And I think when there's a budgetary stress like you have right now in the Kurdistan region, people see it as being we call it the zero-sum game. That if he gets salary, I will not get salary. That's how they tend to view things. Maybe that's natural to feel that way. I don't know if there's anything that we can do about it as the U.S. government, except for continuing to speak about disability rights, to talk about the need to respect other people, even if they're not, look like us or able to move like us. I would hope that the people would change their opinion. The more they can interact with disabled people and understand that they have the same rights and needs as anyone else. But it's a really tough conversation. In America, I don't think it really happened until we passed this legislation and forced society to actually integrate with the disabled people that were already existing kind of in the shadows and hidden from folks. But I promise you I will try. My year that I'm here, I'll try and advocate for, of course, human rights and disability rights as part of those.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ms. Kathryn. Thank you for your time. Thanks so much. Sir, if you have anything, please go ahead.
No, Spas, thank you guys so much. I really had a good time, and it's nice to talk to all of you. So I hope that we can meet in person at some point when the COVID-19 has gone away.
Hopefully. Thank you so much. سپاس بۆ هەمووتان بەڕێزان کاتێکی خۆش بيوك سودي هبوا وملاك قطع لك. Have a nice time. Bye bye.
Bye.